If you ever needed proof that a crown doesn't automatically make someone noble, just take a stroll through the darker corners of history. There you'll find kings who didn't merely misuse their power, they weaponized it. Kings who treated human lives like currency, who built monuments out of bones, who feared betrayal so intensely that they executed the very people trying to love them. Let's begin with King Leopold II of Belgium, a man whose cruelty was so vast that it feels like something out of fiction. Except every word of it happened. If history were a courtroom, Leopold would be the defendant everyone refuses to defend. His great masterpiece of evil was the Congo Free State, a territory he personally owned and operated like a private business. He didn't even consider it part of Belgium. It was his. Imagine someone buying an entire nation the way they'd buy a beach house, and then using the population as unpaid labour on a rubber plantation the size of Western Europe. Leopold told the world he was going to end slavery in Central Africa and uplift the locals with Christian civilization. In reality, he built a system of forced labour so ruthless that it might as well have been designed by a committee of demons. Villages were required to meet rubber quotas or face mutilation, torture, hostage-taking, village burnings and executions. Soldiers who wasted ammunition were required to prove every bullet had been used on a person, so they chopped off hands as receipts. That wasn't symbolic. It wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. A man could come home with his entire family dead because he failed to gather enough sap from a tree. That was the equivalent of your boss saying, "Your sales numbers are low this week, so hand over a body part." And as bodies piled up, Leopold hid behind a smokescreen of propaganda. He hired journalists to sing his praises, staged charitable organizations, and issued press releases about humanitarian progress. He became the first king in history who managed to commit mass atrocities by remote control. He never needed to look his victims in the eye. He was a master manipulator, a PR genius of evil, and when the truth finally came out, when missionaries smuggled photos, when whistleblowers published reports, the world was stunned. Millions had died. Entire communities had been erased. Leopold's response: he destroyed incriminating archives. He torched the paperwork as if history itself could be rewritten by fire. But the ghosts of the Congo were louder than any flame. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. From cold industrial cruelty, let's shift into something more medieval. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, wasn't just a conqueror. He was a natural disaster wearing armour. If destruction had a favourite son, Timur was it. Born in Central Asia in the 14th century, he styled himself as the successor to Genghis Khan, though Genghis would have raised an eyebrow at Timur's methods and said, "Okay, that's a bit much." Timur didn't conquer cities simply to rule them. He conquered cities to annihilate them in the most theatrical and horrifying ways imaginable. In Persia, Syria, India, Anatolia and beyond, Timur left behind a signature calling card: pyramids made of human skulls. He didn't do that for strategic reasons, he did it for aesthetics. He wanted future generations to whisper his name with a mixture of awe and fear. In Isfahan, after a rebellion, he ordered the execution of tens of thousands of civilians. His soldiers dutifully collected heads for the construction of skull towers so enormous that travellers described them with the same tone someone today might use for a skyscraper. Timur didn't prefer subtlety. He once invaded the city of Delhi and unleashed such destruction that one chronicler wrote the city was left with no cat, no dog, no bird. His campaigns depopulated entire regions. When he conquered Baghdad, he slaughtered so many people that he needed 120 skull towers to display them. It's difficult to fathom cruelty on that scale. It would be like someone walking into a crowded stadium, emptying it out entirely, and then arranging the remains into macabre sculptures for decoration. And yet Timur justified all this with a veneer of religious and imperial mission. He claimed he was restoring order, restoring empire, restoring destiny. But what he actually restored, over and over again, was ash. His empire collapsed within a generation, but the scars he left behind lasted centuries. The irony is that Timur considered himself a brilliant statesman, and in a way, he was. But if Genghis Khan built empires, Timur built graveyards. Now let's turn to a king whose brutality wasn't expressed solely through conquest, but through paranoia so thick it could have been bottled and sold as a weapon. Even the Fourth of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, did something few rulers achieve. He lived up to his nickname, In fact, some historians argue terrible is too soft. Dreadful, horrifying, or nightmare with a crown may have been more accurate. Ivan began his life in trauma. His father died young, his mother was poisoned. He grew up surrounded by nobles who treated him like a pawn, and he developed the worldview of a child who learned early on that love is always a trap. When Ivan came to power, he did not forget. He created Russia's first official terror organization, the Oprichnina. These were black-cloaked enforcers who rode through cities like a grim army of fear. Their job was simple: identify anyone who might betray the Tsar and remove them permanently. Ivan's definition of betrayal was flexible. A noble with too much land, traitor. A merchant who annoyed him, traitor. A friend who hesitated when speaking, traitor. The devastation reached its peak when Ivan turned his fury on the wealthy and independent city of Novgorod. Convinced the population was plotting treason, he launched a massacre that lasted weeks. Men, women, children, anyone unlucky enough to cross the path of the Oprichniki was drowned, stabbed, burned, or beaten. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes so horrifying that even centuries later they read like something from a dystopian novel. That was the equivalent of a paranoid father deciding his family might be planning a surprise party and responding by burning down the entire house. And then there's the infamous story of Ivan killing his own son. In a fit of rage, triggered by a dispute over politics and possibly his daughter-in-law's clothing, Ivan struck his heir with his staff so violently that the young man collapsed and died. When Ivan realized what he'd done, he wept over the body. It's one of history's perfect tragedies. A king who destroyed the very future he claimed to protect. Russia would spend the following decades in chaos, all because one man's paranoia overpowered his humanity. From paranoia, we move to obsession. Specifically, the obsession of one king who feared death so deeply that he tried to erase it with architecture, philosophy, and ironically, lethal medicine. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the unifier of China, was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. He ended the Warring States period, standardized writing and currency, built massive roads, and laid the groundwork for a centralized empire that would last 2,000 years. But behind all his accomplishments was a man driven by fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of disorder, and above all, fear of mortality. Qin Shi Huang embraced legalism, a philosophy that valued strict laws and harsh punishments. Under his rule, disagreement wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. Thousands of books were burned because they questioned his ideology. Hundreds of scholars were buried alive to discourage dissent. That wasn't just censorship, that was the equivalent of your boss deleting your entire email account and then burying your co-workers for referencing last year's files. And then there was his obsession with immortality. He consulted alchemists, magicians, and charlatans who promised eternal life. Unfortunately for him, many of these elixirs of immortality were made of mercury. So the emperor drank poison daily, believing he was defying death while actually speeding toward it. But the greatest, strangest monument to Qin Shi Huang's fear is his tomb, a vast underground world with rivers of mercury, ceilings painted with stars, and an army of thousands of terracotta soldiers. These soldiers weren't just statues, they were crafted with unique faces and armor so the emperor could command an army in the afterlife. The man literally built a second empire underground. Workers who built the tomb were sealed inside to keep its secrets. Imagine being so afraid of death that you prepare a 1,000-year military campaign for it. And yet, for all his attempts to control the world and the afterlife, Qin Shi Huang died on a road trip far from home, poisoned by his own medicine. His dynasty collapsed shortly after. His paranoia created unity, but at a cost paid in human lives and cultural destruction. Now let's talk about a king whose evil was more personal, more intimate, and arguably more unpredictable. Herod the Great, ruler of Judea, was a man of contradictions. He was a brilliant builder. He constructed fortresses, palaces, aqueducts, and entire cities. He renovated the temple in Jerusalem, creating one of the most magnificent religious structures of the ancient world. And yet behind the architecture was a man who trusted no one. Not his generals, not his advisors, not even his own family. Herod lived in a permanent state of fear, convinced that plots and conspiracies were hiding behind every wall. To be fair, some were. but Herod dealt with them by executing anyone who even seemed like a threat. His wife Mariamne, whom he loved deeply, was executed because he feared she might betray him. When she died, he went into a spiral of guilt so severe that he had servants beaten for not bringing her back. His mother-in-law, executed. His brother-in-law, drowned under suspicious circumstances. 3 of his own sons, killed because he suspected they were planning to overthrow him. That was the equivalent of dreaming your family whispered about you behind your back and waking up convinced the dream counts as legal evidence. Herod's paranoia became so infamous that Emperor Augustus supposedly joked it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. In an era when kings executed enemies, Herod executed relatives. His rule was a cycle of loyalty, fear, suspicion, and violence. Yet he still managed to build some of the greatest structures of the ancient world. He was a genius and a tyrant, a man who balanced grandeur with cruelty like 2 sides of a sword. And for our final bad king, we have to go to Korea, where King Yeonsangun of the Joseon dynasty wasn't just a bad ruler. He was a psychological crisis wrapped in royal silk. His tyranny didn't begin with malice, but with childhood trauma. His mother, Queen Yun, was executed when he was young, and court officials swept the scandal under the rug. Years later, when Yeonsangun became king, he lifted that rug and found enough resentment to fuel a reign of terror. He launched the first literati purge, targeting scholars whose only crime was writing poetry that he believed insulted the royal family. That was the equivalent of someone posting a vague comment online, and the government responding by arresting everyone who liked it. Scholars were exiled, tortured, or killed over metaphors. Yeonsangun wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for vengeance and footnotes. Then he shut down Korea's top Confucian academy and turned it into his personal entertainment complex. He filled it with singers, dancers, and seized women from across the kingdom, many taken from their families by force. Imagine your country's most prestigious university suddenly becoming a nightclub because the king was bored. When he finally uncovered the truth about his mother's death, the second literati purge erupted, far bloodier than the first. Officials were mutilated, executed, or forced to watch their families die. Some had only distant connections to the original event, but Yeonsangun didn't care. He treated a 20-year-old conspiracy like it was happening in real time. He created a secret police force to spy on taverns and markets, arresting anyone overheard complaining about him. A casual remark over dinner could end your life. Even animals weren't safe. He once ordered palace pets killed for disturbing his sleep. His cruelty spiraled until the court finally had enough. Officials staged a coup, deposed him, stripped him of royal status, and exiled him. Without power to feed his paranoia, Yeonsangun collapsed and died shortly after. His reign remains one of Korea's darkest chapters, a king who weaponized his trauma, punished a nation for his pain, and proved that when a ruler can't control his own mind, he'll try to control everyone else instead, with disastrous results. What unites these 6 kings, Leopold, Timur, Ivan, Qin Shi Huang, Herod, and Yeonsangun, is not just their capacity for evil, but the way their personalities shaped entire populations. Leopold's greed stole millions of lives and reshaped Central Africa. Timur's hunger for destruction turned cities into wastelands. Ivan's paranoia carved fear into the foundations of Russia. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with control unified China, but smothered countless lives in the process. Herod's instability turned a kingdom into a family tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Yeonsangun terrorized his kingdom through mass purges, censorship, brutal executions, and the forced seizure of women, turning Korea's government and institutions into tools for his personal vengeance and indulgence. Each man believed he was justified. Each believed he was chosen, or correct, or destined. That's the dangerous part. These men wore crowns, but they ruled like storms. And in the end, history remembers them not for their titles, but for the destruction they left behind. That is the legacy of the most evil kings in history, and it's a legacy we study so that it never becomes our future.